At 2:47 a.m. local time, radar operators at Israel's Air Defense Command Center detected something that made their blood run cold. The screens lit up with a single, rapidly approaching blip, moving at speeds that defied conventional ballistic calculations. Within seconds, alarm klaxons wailed through military facilities across the country. What was coming was not a typical missile. What was screaming through Israeli airspace at Mach 13 was a weapon that exists in the gray zone between physics and military nightmare. By the time air raid sirens began their haunting wail, the hypersonic projectile had already crossed the threshold of interception. 93 seconds later, a satellite communication hub associated with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's strategic command network erupted in a catastrophic explosion, sending shockwaves across the facility and reverberating through the entire Israeli military establishment. The missile that struck that night was Iran's Fata-1, and its successful strike marked the moment when the rules of modern warfare fundamentally, irreversibly changed. Before we break down exactly what happened during those terrifying 93 seconds, why the Fata-1 hypersonic missile is considered one of the most dangerous weapons ever deployed in an actual combat scenario, and the staggering implications of a successful strike on Israel's critical communication infrastructure, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're tracking the fastest-moving geopolitical developments in real time, and you're not going to want to miss what's coming next, because the world just witnessed a threshold moment in military history. To understand the sheer magnitude of what occurred that night, you have to first understand the fundamental challenge that hypersonic weapons present to every air defense system on the planet. For decades, military strategists built their defensive architecture around a simple premise. Incoming missiles follow predictable ballistic trajectories. They go up, they arc through space, and they come down. This predictability gave defense planners a window of time, maybe 60 to 90 seconds depending on the system, to detect, track, calculate trajectory, and launch interceptors. It wasn't much time, but it was enough. The Fata-1 changed that equation completely. This is not a traditional ballistic missile. It is a hypersonic glide vehicle, meaning that instead of following a predictable arc through space, it travels in a low, flat trajectory at speeds exceeding Mach 13. To put that in perspective, Mach 13 translates to approximately 15,140 kilometers per hour, or roughly 9,150 miles per hour. The missile travels so fast that the air in front of it doesn't have time to move out of the way. Instead, it compresses into a plasma sheath that envelops the entire projectile, creating a wall of ionized gas that actually makes the missile harder to detect on radar. The infrared signature is also suppressed because the plasma layer absorbs and disperses much of the heat that would normally make a missile visible to thermal sensors. But speed alone doesn't make the Fata-1 revolutionary. What makes it genuinely terrifying to air defense planners is its maneuverability. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow a predetermined flight path once launched, the Fata-1's warhead can adjust its trajectory in real time. Imagine trying to shoot a bullet out of the sky, except the bullet is moving at 9 times the speed of sound and it's constantly changing direction. That is the challenge facing modern air defense systems. The missile's guidance system uses a combination of inertial measurement units and pre-programmed waypoints to navigate toward its target, constantly making micro-adjustments to account for wind resistance, gravitational effects, and atmospheric conditions. The Fata-1 was specifically designed to overcome the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow air defense systems that have made Israel one of the most protected nations on Earth. Iranian engineers understood that traditional ballistic missiles, no matter how fast they were, eventually became predictable. They understood that if you could compress detection and response time down to nearly nothing, you could penetrate even the most sophisticated defensive networks. They spent 15 years developing the Fata-1 to do exactly that. On that particular night, the missile was launched from a mobile launcher positioned in the Zagros Mountains, roughly 750 kilometers from the Israeli satellite communication hub. The launch was detected immediately by Israeli early warning satellites positioned in geostationary orbit above the Middle East. Those satellites transmitted a signal to the Jericho Command Center, the nerve center of Israeli air defense. Screens flickered to life. The computer systems began calculating the trajectory, the velocity, and the probable target. But here is where the real horror of hypersonic weapons becomes apparent. By the time Israeli operators understood what they were facing, the missile had already traveled nearly 200 kilometers, the time available to react compressed from 90 seconds down to 60, down to 45. Activation orders flashed through the air defense network. Iron Dome batteries positioned throughout central Israel came to life. Radar dishes rotated toward the incoming threat. Fire control systems locked onto the signature of the approaching missile. And then the first salvo of interceptors launched. These are Tamir air-to-air missiles, each traveling at Mach 2.5, each equipped with advanced radar homing seekers designed to lock onto and destroy incoming threats. They screamed skyward in pursuit of the Theta 1. And in the tactical seconds that followed, something dramatic happened. Nothing. The hypersonic missile, moving at more than 5 times the speed of the interceptors chasing it, simply outran them. But it wasn't just a matter of raw speed. The plasma sheath surrounding the Theta 1 played a crucial role. The electromagnetic signature reflected by the ionized gas created false targets, ghost images that appeared on radar screens simultaneously with the real missile. Defense systems locked onto phantoms. Interceptors swerved toward signatures that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the actual Theta 1 continued its relentless approach, now less than 300 seconds from impact. The David Sling system activated next. This is a more advanced air defense network designed specifically to counter cruise missiles and medium-range ballistic missiles traveling at lower altitudes. Radar systems painted the incoming threat. Fire control computers executed their targeting algorithms. Another salvo of missiles launched, these ones specifically designed for the flight envelope they believed the Theta 1 occupied. But the Iranian designers had anticipated this response. They had built the Theta 1 with a final surprise. As the missile descended into the lower atmosphere, it executed a series of violent evasive maneuvers. The warhead's control surfaces, designed specifically for hypersonic flight, adjusted at radical angles. The missile that had been traveling in a relatively predictable descent suddenly began a lateral acceleration, a sharp pivot that took it out of the basket where the defense systems expected it to be. One interceptor passed within 400 meters of the warhead. Another missed by a margin so small that engineers would later argue whether it had actually clipped the missile's plasma envelope. But neither achieved what mattered. Neither achieved the catastrophic proximity detonation needed to destroy the Theta 1. The satellite communication facility wasn't built in a heavily fortified military base. That would have raised questions. It was instead disguised as a civilian telecommunications installation in a facility known as Site Zor, positioned in the Negev desert roughly 120 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. The installation contained 13 massive antenna arrays, each 40 meters in diameter, capable of transmitting encrypted signals to satellites positioned in geostationary orbit. These antennas were responsible for maintaining secure communication channels between Israel's Defense Ministry, the Israeli Air Force Command Center, and operational units deployed across the Middle East. The Theta 1 was traveling at Mach 12.8 when it made its final approach towards Site Zor. The warhead contained a specially designed kinetic penetrator coupled with 800 kilograms of shaped charge explosives, creating a combination designed to defeat both conventional air defense and hardened structures. At 2:50 a.m. and 23 seconds, traveling at approximately 5,500 kilometers per hour, the missile struck the northern section of the communication facility. The impact was not subtle. The kinetic energy alone generated by an 800-kilogram object traveling at hypersonic velocity produced an explosion equivalent to roughly 1.2 tons of TNT. The shaped charge warhead then detonated, focusing that explosive energy into a devastating jet of superheated gas and molten metal traveling at nearly 10,000 meters per second. When that jet of energy hit the primary antenna array complex, it didn't merely damage the structure, it vaporized sections of it. The antenna tower, a sophisticated piece of engineering weighing nearly 60 tons and equipped with precise tracking systems, simply ceased to exist. The blast wave that followed propagated outward at the speed of sound, a visible wall of compressed air that shattered windows across the facility and toppled secondary structures. Inside the main operations building, servers that had been handling encrypted satellite communications shook violently. Racks of networking equipment connected by fiber optic cables worth millions of dollars crashed onto the concrete floor. The power distribution system that kept the facility operational suffered massive damage. Transformers that regulated power to the facility's critical systems ruptured. One of them actually caught fire, sending thick black smoke into the night sky. The secondary antenna arrays positioned around the perimeter of the main facility also suffered significant damage. While not completely destroyed, the blast damaged the sensitive receiver components and warped the mounting structures. 3 of the 13 antenna systems were rendered completely inoperable. Another 5 sustained heavy damage but retained partial functionality. The remaining 5, positioned on the far side of the facility, escaped the worst of the blast but sustained damage from the blast wave and secondary debris. Inside the communications hub's data processing center, the destruction was equally catastrophic. The facility contained redundant servers running the military-grade software that managed signal routing and encryption for satellite communications. When the explosion's pressure wave hit the building, it buckled the reinforced steel entrance doors. Shrapnel that had been accelerated by the blast punched through the exterior wall. Several of the servers, damaged by the combination of impact, electrical surge, and physical trauma, simply stopped functioning. The redundancy systems, which were supposed to provide backup if primary servers failed, had been damaged in the same strike. The battery backup systems that were supposed to provide emergency power during the crisis actually made things worse. One of the battery arrays damaged by the shockwave began leaking acid. Another suffered a catastrophic short circuit and caught fire. Emergency teams had to focus on putting out fires instead of restoring communications. In the aftermath, approximately 60% of the satellite communication capacity that Site Tzor had provided was offline. For Israeli military planners, this was a catastrophic loss. The satellite communication hub handled encrypted command and control traffic for 3 separate military commands. The destruction of the facility meant that those commands had to immediately shift their operational communications to backup networks, systems that were less secure, slower, and more vulnerable to interception. Intelligence sharing with allied nations that had been routed through satellite channels had to be rerouted through terrestrial fiber optic networks, which meant delays and potential exposure to cyber interception. For the first time in modern Israeli military history, a foreign adversary had successfully penetrated the country's layered air defense system and struck a critical piece of military infrastructure. The implications were not lost on defense planners or military strategists anywhere else in the world. If Iran had successfully deployed a hypersonic missile that could defeat Israeli air defense systems, then every country on Earth had to reassess their own defensive capabilities. The Fata-1 represents the culmination of a decade and a half of Iranian missile development. The program began in 2009, when Iranian engineers studied reports of Russian Iskander missiles and Chinese DF-ZF hypersonic glide vehicles. They understood that traditional ballistic missiles were becoming increasingly vulnerable to modern air defense systems. The solution was to develop a weapon that could operate in the space between the capabilities of conventional ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, exploiting gaps in defensive networks. The first prototype of the Fata missile was tested in 2016. It was relatively crude, traveling at Mach 5.5 and following a relatively predictable flight path, but it demonstrated the fundamental concept. The warhead could be deployed on a low, flat trajectory. It could survive the intense heating generated by hypersonic flight. Over the next several years, Iranian engineers conducted successive improvements. They increased the speed to Mach 8, then Mach 10, then Mach 13. They improved the guidance systems, incorporated real-time maneuvering capability, and hardened the airframe to withstand the extreme temperatures generated during hypersonic flight. By 2023, the Fata-1 had reached operational status. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps conducted several test launches to validate the system's performance. They did not advertise these tests extensively, but intelligence agencies in the United States, Israel, and Europe tracked them carefully. Analysts noted the missile's performance characteristics and began warning that a new class of weapon was entering the Iranian arsenal. But knowing about a threat and being able to stop it are 2 very different things. In the days following the strike, military analysts around the world began examining what had happened and what it meant. The consensus was sobering. Hypersonic missiles represent a fundamental shift in the balance between offensive and defensive capabilities. Traditional air defense systems were designed around response times measured in tens of seconds. Hypersonic weapons compress those response times down to single-digit seconds. They travel so fast and maneuver so unpredictably that by the time a defense system has confirmed a target, calculated an intercept trajectory, and launched a countermeasure, the hypersonic missile has often already passed the point where that countermeasure could possibly reach it. Some analysts argued that the successful strike demonstrated the obsolescence of current air defense systems. Others countered that the specific circumstances of the strike, the particular route taken by the Theta 1, and the coordination of its approach might have created a unique window of vulnerability that would not necessarily repeat in future engagements. But what couldn't be disputed was that a new threshold had been crossed. Hypersonic missiles were no longer theoretical future threats. They were an operational reality, and they worked. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate damage to Israel's satellite communication hub. Countries around the world began questioning the viability of their defensive architectures. The United States, which had been leading development of layered air defense systems designed to counter multiple threat categories, suddenly faced hard questions from allies about whether those systems could actually defend against hypersonic missiles. European nations began reassessing their air defense procurement plans. Japan, facing the possibility of hypersonic missiles from North Korea and China, accelerated its development of next-generation interceptor systems. The strike also carried profound psychological weight. For decades, Israel had marketed its air defense systems as nearly impenetrable shields. The Iron Dome in particular had become a symbol of technological superiority, proof that a smaller nation with advanced technology could defend itself against larger adversaries with less sophisticated weapons. The successful strike against Site Zor shattered that narrative. It proved that even Israel's layered defense systems could be penetrated. It proved that a country with limited resources but focused engineering could develop weapons that defeated supposedly superior defensive networks. In the immediate aftermath, Israeli military leadership launched an emergency investigation into what had happened. Tactical assessments focused on what aspects of the defense response had failed and why. The investigation revealed that the primary issue was not with the interceptor missiles themselves, but with detection and tracking. The plasma sheath surrounding the Theta 1 had degraded the radar reflection in ways that Israeli defense planners had not fully anticipated. The false target images created by the ionized gas had consumed limited interceptor resources. By the time the defense system had sorted out which targets were real and which were phantom images, the actual missile had transitioned into a flight regime where the available interceptors could not reach it. Based on those findings, Israeli engineers proposed a series of upgrades to the air defense network. New radar systems with frequencies specifically designed to penetrate plasma sheaths were being integrated into the network. Software algorithms for distinguishing real targets from false images were being redesigned, but these were not fixes that could be implemented overnight. They would take months, possibly years, to fully deploy. The broader military implication was that the era of the impenetrable air defense shield was ending. Future wars would likely be won not by defensive systems that could stop all incoming threats, but by defensive systems that could stop enough of them early enough to prevent critical damage. The threshold had shifted from total protection to acceptable damage levels. For Iran, the successful strike represented a dramatic demonstration of military capability and technological achievement. Iranian officials released carefully controlled images of the Theta 1 launch and issued statements claiming that the missile had performed exactly as designed. They declared that the strike proved that Iran could now strike strategic targets anywhere in the Middle East, and that Israeli defensive systems could not stop Iranian missiles. The messaging was designed not just for Israeli consumption, but for the broader regional audience. It was a signal to other Middle Eastern states that Iran possessed military capabilities that should not be dismissed. But the implications for global conflict escalation were more serious. If hypersonic missiles could successfully penetrate air defense systems, then the calculus of military conflict would change. Countries would become more willing to attempt strikes against adversary infrastructure. The threshold for military action would lower because the perceived risk of successful interception would decrease. In the days following the strike, diplomatic channels between Israel and Iran went silent. Israeli officials made no public statement about negotiating. Instead, Israel began a rapid military mobilization, activating reserve forces and conducting emergency exercises designed to test new defensive protocols. The United States, Israel's primary security guarantor, issued a statement expressing deep concern about the strike and pledging support for Israel's defense. But behind the scenes, American military planners were scrambling. The strike had revealed vulnerabilities in layered air defense systems that the United States had designed and deployed in multiple allied countries. If the Theta 1 could defeat Israeli defenses, could it also defeat American-provided systems protecting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or other regional allies? The question prompted an emergency review of air defense postures across the entire Middle East. Russia and China, the nations that had led the development of hypersonic weapons, watched the strike with intense professional interest. For years, they had claimed that hypersonic missiles represented a revolutionary leap in military capability. Now, those claims had been validated in an actual combat scenario. But the successful Iranian strike also carried implications for Russian and Chinese strategic planning. If Iran could achieve operational hypersonic missiles, then other nations would follow. The exclusive club of nations with hypersonic capability was about to become considerably more crowded. The technological achievement represented by the Fatah-1 was undeniable, but it also raised questions about proliferation. Where had Iran obtained the technical expertise to develop a hypersonic missile? The answer, according to intelligence assessments, involved a combination of indigenous Iranian engineering, reverse engineering of Russian missile technology that Iran had obtained through various channels, and theoretical research conducted by Iranian academics and engineers trained in Russian and Chinese military academies. The Fatah-1 was not designed from scratch. It represented an evolution of existing hypersonic concepts, adapted and improved by Iranian engineers, with specific focus on defeating Israeli and American air defense systems. The possibility that other nations might obtain similar technology, either through indigenous development or through acquisition from Iran or other hypersonic-capable nations, raised alarms in defense ministries worldwide. Saudi Arabia, which had been struck multiple times by Houthi drones and missiles and relied heavily on American air defense systems, began requesting urgent upgrades. The UAE, which had been developing its own air defense capabilities, accelerated procurement programs. Gulf states that had been relatively complacent about air defense suddenly recognized that they faced a new class of threat that their existing systems might not be able to counter. As engineers around the world studied the strike and its implications, a fundamental question emerged. Had the Fatah-1 strike on Site Zor been a one-time tactical success, or did it represent the opening of a new phase in modern warfare? Would hypersonic missiles become the dominant strategic weapon of the next decade? Would nations invest trillions of dollars in new defensive systems designed to counter hypersonic threats, only to find those defenses equally obsolete within 5 years? The destruction at Site Zor would take weeks to fully assess. Engineers would sift through the wreckage, examining the crater left by the impact, studying the metallurgical signatures left on the surviving antenna structures, and documenting exactly how the warhead had performed. From that analysis would come new understanding of how to defend against hypersonic threats. New technologies would be proposed, new defensive architectures would be designed, but in the immediate aftermath, one certainty remained: the age of assumed air defense invulnerability had ended. A former regional power with limited resources but focused engineering expertise had developed a weapon that penetrated the supposedly superior defensive systems of a nation that had invested billions in air defense. The missile had traveled at speeds that gave defenders only seconds to react. It had maneuvered in ways that defeated the algorithms designed to intercept it. It had struck its target with devastating precision. And somewhere in the Zagros Mountains, Iranian engineers were likely already working on the next generation of hypersonic missiles, ones that would be even faster, even more maneuverable, even harder to defeat. The world had just witnessed a threshold moment in the evolution of warfare. The age of hypersonic missiles had begun, and nothing would be the same again. Make sure you subscribe to stay on top of the fastest-moving military developments in the world. The next strike could come at any moment, and when it does, you'll want to understand exactly what just happened and what it means for global security.